Okay, perfect. We are live. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us at State of the Horn. My name is Hannah, and I am joined by my colleagues Hanan and Salam. Our colleague Kia, who was an integral part of the organization of this event, and to the State of the Horn team. Sorry, it was recording. State of the Horn team is not able to make it here today. And so we just really wanted to acknowledge her in this space. We at State of the Horn are a nonpartisan, impartial, and independent platform, a grassroots initiative driven by a deep love for our ancestral homeland and its people. We serve as a neutral platform for dialogue surrounding our complex history, politics, and colorful experiences. Those of you who have attended our previous events will know that we were in the middle of our Rewind series, a historical series which aimed to examine the history of Ethiopia from different perspectives. During our October seminar, we invited scholars to discuss the 1200s to the 1500s, while our November seminar focused on Emperor Menelik. And our January seminar was scheduled to discuss the Haile Selassie era. However, given the humanitarian crisis that has erupted back home, specifically in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, we felt it was necessary to hold a conversation with community members, in particular from the Tagaru or Tigrayan community, to learn about what is happening in Tigray today and how members of the Horn of Africa and their friends and allies can stand in solidarity with the population affected. The structure of today's event will look slightly different than our more interactive previous events, and we have designed it as such to ensure a safe space for all of our speakers and audience members to ensure we can highlight and focus on learning about the humanitarian crisis. We are joined today by a number of distinguished.
So first we have Maza Gide. Maza is a Tigrayan activist who founded the hashtag Yikono movement, the first independent women's rights movement in Tigray. And currently she is a full-time student pursuing her master's degree in international relations. We have Getachew Tamare. Getachew has worked for government and non-governmental organizations as both a lawyer and legal advisor. He works on conflict analysis and human rights advocacy issues. He has been part of the opposition against the current government until 2016 when he had to flee the country due to concerns for his safety. He holds an LLB from Mekelle University. Samuel Gabru serves as the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, advancing the economic interests of Black businesses, organizations, and people. A social entrepreneur and community organizer, he also serves as the Managing Director of Black Lion Strategies, a boutique social impact consulting firm building on his over 15 years of political and nonprofit experience in the United States and Ethiopia. Ambassador Aurelia Brazil retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2008 with the rank of career minister after a distinguished 40-year career. Among many other accomplishments, she was the first female African-American career Foreign Service officer to be promoted into the Senior Foreign Service and the first to be nominated as an ambassador. She served most recently as ambassador to Ethiopia from 2002 to 2005, after ambassadorships to Kenya and the Federated States of Micronesia. Ambassador David Shin has a wealth of experience in diplomacy and has served in numerous State Department leadership roles, both at home and abroad. He served as a U.S. ambassador twice to Burkina Faso from 1987 to 1990 and Ethiopia from 1996 to 1998. He is currently an adjunct professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. And these are just small samples of what these very accomplished people have all done, and we'll include their full bios in the chat for you to review. And so we're going to get things started with our discussion questions. We received many questions from our event attendees, and so we thank all of you for submitting many questions. We're going to try to get through as many as we possibly can. I think that the common thread here was that everyone who's attending this event genuinely wants to know what is really going on in Tigray and what's the humanitarian crisis look like and how can we help, most importantly. So to start things off, we're going to have each of our speakers answer our first question and then we'll move on. So for our audience, can you shed light on your work in Ethiopia and why raising awareness of this crisis is important to you? And we'll start with Samuel.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, wherever you all are in the world. Thank you for having us. This is an excellent event, and I'm glad to be here. I've been very active with US-Ethiopia relations for 15 years, really promoting Ethiopia and the opportunities for investment, tourism, partnerships with anyone, whether it's college students or nonprofits, university partnerships, business partnerships and investments. Really did, and hopefully still believe in somewhat of a strong united Ethiopia. It may not look like it today, given the realities on the ground, but I am very much an impatient optimist and stubbornly so sometimes. But I'm very passionate about the Ethiopian people, the history, obviously the culture, and having invested a lot of my time and efforts promoting Ethiopia in the United States, and particularly in New England and in Massachusetts. What's going on obviously does break my heart. And so my interests are really ending conflict, pushing for a national inclusive dialogue, and making sure that the Ethiopian people as a whole can heal. There's a lot of generational trauma and confusion and anger that lingers around. My hope is to see all of that in the rearview mirror one day. So it's great to be here, but thank you.
And Ambassador Brazil, would you like to go next?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be participating with this group, to learn about the group, and I salute you all for starting the group and hope that it's successful. I'm interested in Ethiopia in particular on this issue because when I arrived in Ethiopia in 2002, Ethiopia was facing a famine at that point where 13 million Ethiopians were at risk of starvation. And I'm proud to say that the United States, together with the Ethiopian government at that time, we were able to bring together the donor community as well as the international community and local groups to address those issues. So I've seen people hungry in Ethiopia. I've seen famine, and I salute USAID at the time that I think mobilized both the academic community to investigate what was going on, but also the government at that time in Ethiopia for being open about what was happening and allowing the donor community to travel all over the country to see for ourselves exactly what was needed. And Tigray, of course, was not exempt from what was going on at that time. So I would like very much to see the humanitarian response to the needs of the people in Tigray, and also to stop the violence, because the UN peacekeepers were there at the time as well because of the border issue with Eritrea. So to me, we don't have a lot of time to waste. We should get to the heart of the issues, and one of those is to feed people and prevent more disaster.
Thank you. Getachew, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you for having us. To give some introduction about myself, I was actively participating in the opposition when I used to live in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And as a lawyer, most of the time I am interested in human rights, especially in human rights violations and such similar concepts. But when this war started, like 96 days before, a person who had all his families in that region, all my immediate families. So the gravity of the situation was, foreseeable from the very beginning to me and my family. And I couldn't communicate with my families almost for 94, 93 days. And then I was reading all the reports coming from the region, the gravity, the disaster, the casualties. So I'm highly interested in conflict and instead, but this is most probably specifically like touching my life. I can sleep, especially when I read the humanitarian crisis. Before that, like I was highly interested in human rights violations all over Ethiopia. It could be in Tigray or it could be in other parts of Ethiopia. So that's why I'm highly interested to this concept.
Thank you. Thank you. Maza, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us today. My name, as stated, is Maza Gide. I am mainly interested in Ethiopia because I am from Ethiopia, particularly from Tigray. I was born and raised in Tigray. I did also live in other parts of Tigray, including Oromia and Addis Ababa. My work previously revolved around, advocating for development and inclusive development, but mainly it was focused on women empowerment. I was mainly concerned in creating, a society that respects women and men equally and that treats them equally. I have worked with movements that are not limited to Tigray, but also across the world, like within Ethiopia. But once the war was, waged against the people of Tigray, not necessarily only against the government of Tigray, my advocacy started to ensure that the Tigrayan people's right to self-determination and self-administration is respected. And in addition to that, the humanitarian corridor is open because for over 4.5 million Tigrayans are facing a man-made famine right now. And as a Tigrayan and also as an advocate of democracy and people's right to self-administration, and also as an intellectual, I have an obligation to speak for the voiceless. And that's where my interest resides around this topic. But I also hope that the people of Ethiopia, not only Tigrayans, all the oppressed people of Ethiopia would have an opportunity to speak for themselves and to decide on what kind of political and developmental aspect they would like to aspire in the near future. And I hope, all stakeholders would be able to come to the negotiation table and discuss and resolve political differences through negotiation and not through guns. So that's where my interest lies on. But I am delighted to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much, Maza. Ambassador Shin?
Yes, thank you very much for including me in this group. My affiliation with Ethiopia began in 1969 when I was the assistant desk officer for Ethiopia in the State Department. And I have continued to be engaged off and on with Ethiopia ever since. In the mid-1990s, was the director for East Africa, Horn of Africa affairs in the State Department, which included Ethiopia, followed by serving as ambassador there in the late 1990s. And since retiring from the State Department, have continued to study Ethiopia in an academic sense, and am the co-author of essentially an encyclopedia on Ethiopia. So my interest in the country has covered many, many decades. When I look at the situation today, my key interests are trying to encourage those kinds of actions that will result in a unified, successful Ethiopia. I think the worst thing that could happen at this point in time would be the breaking up of the country or the Balkanization of Ethiopia. And I encourage steps that try to discourage that. I'm also interested in a US policy towards Ethiopia that I think contributes to this effort and is a responsible policy. And I make what little modest effort I can in that regard. So it's a long-standing interest in the country. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And we're going to just move into our first question. as Salam had mentioned with the survey results, overwhelmingly, people want to help the refugees. They want to help what's happening in Tigray. And so we also noticed with the survey results that there was a wide array in terms of people's understanding of what's going on. Some people knew or very well informed, other people did not know or had questions. And so to start off, and this is a question for anyone, can you share why the crisis in Tigray is a humanitarian crisis? And this is a question for anyone, given that there's a diversity in terms of the people in the room who are either understanding of what's going on or people who do not know what's going on. If you could shed light on that.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and I hope other people will chime in. It's a humanitarian crisis because you have the ordinary population, every population affected somehow by the situation. Not only the fighting, but also the inability to communicate, the inability to access food, as I understand it, perhaps the destruction of food by people fighting, the lack of access to clean water, to medicines, to the ordinary things that gives life some safety. So that brings about understanding that there is a humanitarian crisis, that people need food, water, medicine, and perhaps other treatments in the midst of a global pandemic as well. So you have that aspect that complicates it. So I don't know why there would be a question about a humanitarian aspect to the issue.
Now, let me add, in terms of a few numbers that we might bring into the discussion. No one knows for certain how many internally displaced persons there are in Tigray today, but I think the lowest estimate I've seen is about 2.5 million out of a population of 6 million plus. And that's a very significant proportion of the population of Tigray. Whenever you have people who are displaced from their homes, it means they are not getting food normally, they are not getting services, they're not getting education, they're not getting anything that is normal in life. And eventually that results in a catastrophic situation. If you can't provide food and services and shelter for these people, many of them simply don't survive. In addition to that, you have a refugee problem of some significance. There are more than 60,000 Tigrayan refugees in Sudan today. There are another almost 100,000 Eritrean refugees inside Tigray, many of whom have been dispersed. 2 of the 4 refugee camps in Tigray region have been totally destroyed. It's not clear who destroyed them, but satellite photography shows that the 2 of them effectively no longer exist. And the 30,000 refugees who were in those 2 camps have been scattered around the countryside. Some of the refugees from the camps closest to the Eritrean border apparently have been taken back to Eritrea. So you have a terrible situation concerning both internally displaced Tigrayans and Tigrayan refugees and Eritrean refugees.
So if I can add something, when I see the gravity of the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, or when I say it's humanitarian crisis, I need to characterize it in 3 ways or in 3 phases. To begin with, as we could understand, most of the communication, all of communication, either the normal communication services, it could be air transport or the land transport, any kind of communication has been cut off almost for 3 months. And because of that, the movement of goods, supply and demand, has already been interrupted in Tigray. And then the war comes. When the war started, there are different actors acting in the war. The Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces, and also the different paramilitary forces, militias, and vigilante groups. So these all forces have their own fair share in destroying the either crops directly or looting the grains of the farmers. So this was this second phase on top of the what you call the locust infestation and some amount of food insecurity at the other parts of Ethiopia. There are also citizens in Tigray who are not secured in their food stuff. And certainly, the government is not willing to provide aid, as I myself have tried to verify from my parents and also from the other independent humanitarian organizations. Here, I want to be clear. When I say humanitarian crisis, we have seen, as Ambassador Aurelia or Ambassador, I think David Sheen has also stated, we have seen some amount of humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia before, but most of the humanitarian crisis especially were tried to be managed by the government and by other international donors. But in this time, in every part of Tigray, we are getting reports from the ground that people are starving. So I need to pinpoint on these most important phases. It's not simply humanitarian crisis, but these three elements of the crisis have brought the humanitarian crisis from the very beginning and to this time. Thank you.
If I could just add, I think the World Food Program announced last night, my time anyway, roughly speaking, I think, that they've reached a deal with Addis to scale up their activities in Tigray. So I'm hoping that that's a bit of good news, and that the scaling up can start quickly to bring more food in.
And just to touch on something that hasn't been mentioned, can someone speak to the reports of sexual violence against women and children in Tigray?
Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to add. So although the root cause of this crisis is a political one, those who are highly impacted by this conflict are civilians. As we have been hearing reports, discussing that over 50,000 civilians have been killed, over 2.5 million people are internally displaced and whatnot. But the most harrowing story for me as a woman, a very feminist and pro-women empowerment woman, is that the rampant rape that is being used as a weapon across Tigray. A lot of women are raped in order to, ranging from the age of 5 all the way to grandparents, they're being raped. They're being sexually harassed and assaulted. And the pain that this kind of weaponized rape leaves on women is not something temporary. It's not just only the violation of the body. It's rather, the fact that these women are being exposed to STD and other kinds of diseases. The fact that because they don't have access to, contraception methods or medicines, they're being forced into, giving birth to children that they didn't wish for. And HIV and other kinds of diseases are highly spreading across Tigray, and our women are being tortured and dehumanized, like not only through the war but also through weaponized rape. And we have been hearing reports from doctors from the very small hospitals that are functional within Tigray at the moment. We have been receiving reports as how women are, coming to the hospitals bleeding, and the doctors don't even have medicine to treat them. So women are actually, bleeding to death. So the sexual harassment and the violence is so scary that we all should, push for immediate humanitarian corridor so that women that have been raped could get the right kind of treatment, starting from medicine all the way to other kinds of treatments. Because if this kind of measures are not taken, then the war is leaving a scar that wouldn't go away in a short period of time, because this women, they're going to continue to live and to relive that trauma as they continue to see the children that they will give birth from someone who raped and violated their body. So there is weaponization of rape, weaponization of sexual harassment. And in my opinion, the main purpose of weaponizing rape is, it's not just only to violate the human the woman's body. It's rather to traumatize the public. It's rather to further subjugate the people of Tigray. And so it's very alarming. The reports, the stories we're hearing are quite shocking, because they're being gang raped. It's not just one soldier or one troop raping one woman. It's a gang group, like adult men raping young kids. So it's very alarming, and it breaks my heart that I have to speak about this in such a kind of manner. But the world needs to know exactly what's happening on the ground so that we can, join efforts, join hands, and bring a solution to it.
Just to add my 2 cents, the other thing that alarms me, in addition to everything everyone just said, is the destruction of religious and historical sites. Some of these sites are World Heritage sites, and going after these sites is an international war crime. And so that there has been a blockade, a siege on Tigray for over 90 days. It's alarming. And even prior to the war, federal budgetary transfers were withheld from Tigray, which meant that certain emergency assistance, including COVID-19 and locust relief and other sort of basic provision of services, were stopped. And so, this very much is a blockade, and some will say that it's just a bunch of bureaucratic bottlenecks here and there and whatever. And sure, I'm inclined to not believe that. I think there's something a bit more systematic here at play, particularly when you think about the criminalization of journalism. Not just over the last 90 days, but really over the last year. We're seeing more and more journalists in Ethiopia be detained without charge for days, if not weeks on end. One of them even last fall, Medhani, one of the editors at Addis Standard, even contracted COVID-19 in jail. And so there's definitely a huge concern here across the board. And so the best thing to do is to provide completely unfettered access to journalists, to the international community, to the UN, NGOs, et cetera. Just let them in, let them do their job. There's no need to have a siege on Tigray. I don't care what your intentions are, that potentially millions of people are starving, including my relatives. That's problematic. And so I think, just lastly, this really does remind me of 1984. When at a different time there was a civil war in Ethiopia and Tigray, and there was a drought which turned into a famine, and the Ethiopian government at the time was also prohibiting international NGOs and the UN from providing relief. And so my hope is that we do not need another We Are the World moment. My hope is that we don't need another Live Aid concert, but it is increasingly looking like that's where we're going.
And now I'll pass it off to Hannah.
Thank you so much. This question we can begin with Ambassador Shin. What do you make of the international community's response to the conflict that you all have so clearly laid out to be a humanitarian crisis on the basis of weaponized aid, sexual violence, the interruption of life, the destruction of religious sites, and so much more violence? What do you make of the international community's response to this conflict? Are they responding adequately? Why or why not? And again, it's for all of the panelists, but we can begin with Ambassador Shin.
Sure. I think generally speaking, the response has been pretty minimal so far, but a lot of that is due to the fact that it's not possible for the international press to get into Tigray to do reporting on the event. There's a lot of confusing information coming out of the area, particularly that which is available to the international community. Those people who are following social media, particularly the Ethiopian diaspora, have a lot more access to information, as good or bad as it may be, than does the international community generally. So the international community is operating to some extent with one hand behind its back. It knows that the situation is bad. It has spoken out pretty clearly about the humanitarian situation in Tigray, particularly organizations like UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Grandi, has actually been into Tigray and made a report on the situation there, but even his visit was very limited. The UN generally has spoken out about the humanitarian situation and the need to try to allow all humanitarian organizations into the region in order to try to resolve the problems that exist there. The United States is on the record as having done the same thing. There has been a call by some international players for the Eritrean forces to leave Tigray. I think it's been fairly well documented that Eritrean forces were in Tigray. Whether they're there today or not, I have no idea. But at least initially they were. So there have been a few things that the international community has been speaking out on. But until you have both Ethiopian press and international press allowed to go into the area, and you have humanitarian organizations working routinely and regularly in Tigray, you're just going to be operating on the basis of very incomplete information. And that's a lot of the problem. So the international community could certainly be doing more. The European Union has withheld some budgetary assistance from the Ethiopian government. That's the only sort of financial sanction I'm aware of that has taken place. But the main thing is for more and better information on exactly what is happening in Tigray, information that can be believed by everyone, not information that comes in a very biased way from one side or the other.
Thank you so much. Does one of our other panelists want to touch on the international community's response?
Well, I'll augment what Ambassador David Shin said. I think France and Germany have both had their leaders talk to the Prime Minister. I think on February 4th, our new relatively new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, talked to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. So I detect some initial mobilization efforts underway internationally to focus in on the humanitarian aspects. I don't know what that means in terms of ignoring or not ignoring, but not emphasizing the continued violence and fighting and shutdown of telecommunications and other aspects of people getting into Tigray. I mentioned the World Food Program of the United Nations, I think has been given a green light to scale up some of its operations. Comparing this to what we found in 2002, 2003, in terms of the famine and food shortages facing Ethiopia at the time as an international community, I think the mechanisms are in place and should be used. But initially, I think people have been slow because of the shutdown of information. No one quite knew what was happening. And that has to change and should be changed by the Ethiopian government, which should open up access for all mechanisms. Someone mentioned the United Nations peacekeeping, and they're called peacekeepers because they keep the peace. They don't. They're not peacemakers, so they cannot go in and make a peace. That has to be done internally. And then I think UN peacekeepers might have a role, or peacekeepers from the African Union.
I'm glad you mentioned the AU ambassador. I've been extraordinarily disappointed in the significant lack of leadership from the African Union on Tigray, but also just the whole campaign around silencing the guns throughout the continent. The AU has shown itself to be, at best incompetent, but at worst irrelevant to the continent in many ways, not just on matters of peace and security, particularly in its home country, in Ethiopia. So that's really concerning to me. I am also concerned because I was very happy about the World Food Programme's statement yesterday. That made me excited. I do wish them all the best, but I'm not optimistic about that just because the Ethiopian government and the United Nations have signed roughly a handful of agreements over the last 2 months for some sort of access to Tigray. A lot of it has been managed access, and a lot of it has been curtailed. And so we're seeing that there are indeed roadblocks to full unfettered access throughout. And then we also saw in December, several aid workers were shot at and several died. And the Ethiopian government admitted that they shot some of them as well, which is deeply concerning to me. Aid workers are not, ordinary civilians just walking around. They have uniforms on. Their vehicles are easy to spot. These are people who are part of their duty is to be easy to spot. And so shooting at aid workers is deeply alarming to me. And I agree with Ambassador Shin. Obviously, the European Union has really carried the water when it comes to Tigray and really the Horn of Africa. The special envoy for the Horn of Africa, Alex Rondos, has been doing a terrific job mobilizing the EU system as a whole, and then also the member states. But then the member states themselves, especially Germany, Belgium, Ireland, and others, are really carrying the water in extraordinary ways. And then Finland, obviously, the foreign minister of Finland has been dispatched to Ethiopia to be the chief negotiator on behalf of the European Union. So they are progressing. I appreciate what Secretary Blinken said in his confirmation hearing that the US has been AWOL, absent without official leave. And I would say that is true for the world, not just Ethiopia. Over the last 4 years, we have embraced a policy in the United States that has really led us to lose a lot of leadership and a lot of sort of moral authority and support for democracy and human rights around the world. And so my hope is that the United States moving forward is going to embrace its values, especially when it comes to fundamental freedoms and human rights, and push that forward not only bilaterally with Ethiopia, but also at the United Nations and especially at the UN Security Council. So I can't wait for Linda Thomas-Greenfield to be confirmed and to be sent to New York as ambassador. I think she'll do a terrific job. She knows Africa very well. And hopefully we will see a bit more movement there because I agree, in order to address a problem, you first need the information. You need to call it a problem. You need to admit that it's a problem, and you need to have the facts at hand in order to come up with a plan. And so that needs to be discussed in the open at the Security Council. That needs to be discussed on the record. There needs to be satellite imagery. There needs to be conversations on what's going on. There needs to be experts, witnesses, victims, whatever, that are sort of brought forward to provide insights, because our diplomats do need that information. And I'm also, just lastly, I'm concerned that I don't think, whether it's in Western reporting or perhaps even Western policymakers or diplomats, I'm not sure if everybody fully understands the sort of larger issues at play in the Horn of Africa and in the Red Sea, and how it's all interconnected. And so I think it's important, whether it's in Washington or New York or Brussels or Geneva, to make sure that people understand sort of the larger forces at play in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, and that the war on Tigray is not some sort of isolated incident. It's not an aberration, but that there are quite a number of conflicts in Ethiopia, quite a number of internally displaced people in Ethiopia. 2 years ago, Ethiopia had more IDPs than Syria, which has been at civil war for a decade. So, we need to have these sorts of conversations and make sure that people understand the full breadth of the problem before they can begin to address it.
Thank you. So our next question that we received we want to talk about how aid has been used in previous famines and conflicts within Ethiopia. And Samuel, you touched on this a little bit. So this question says, many people are unaware of the history of the famine in Tigray and Wollo that occurred in the 50s, 70s, and 80s. Can you speak to this history of events? Why was this happening?
Are you asking me that question, or?
No, I just mentioned
Okay.
you had touched on the response to the famine previously in 1984. Right. And so
I would defer to other folks. The only thing I'll say is John Young has a great book that he wrote in 1997, I believe, on the history of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And he mentions in his book that between 1889 and 1997, Tigray, so in roughly a century, Tigray had experienced at least 17 famines, the worst of which was 1984, but there were many famines before. And that's all I'll say, that this is a region that is prone to violence and famine, but of people who are not only beautiful and resilient, but also people who wish nothing but peace.
Now let me add here, and this is sort of a shout out to US policy historically. The United States has always been the first with the most when it comes to food aid and humanitarian assistance generally around the world and in Ethiopia. The track record of the United States since the end of World War II and providing food aid to Ethiopia is, I think, remarkable. Even when you go back to the mid-1980s, which was the worst of the post-war famines, and it was during the period when Mengistu Haile Mariam was in charge of the government. The United States had a terrible relationship with Mengistu. Basically, we withdrew our ambassador and had a very small mission there. Most elements of the relationship broke down. But once that famine broke out, although the United States was a little reluctant initially to move in with large amounts of aid, it did eventually move in spite of the Mengistu government, and provided the bulk of assistance going into Ethiopia and for Ethiopian refugees in Sudan at the time. And it has done that pretty much ever since. We had a modest famine when I served in Ethiopia. Ray Brazil mentioned there was one when she arrived. They are regular now, and unfortunately they recur with greater frequency than they have done historically. But the United States has always come forward and supported the needs of the Ethiopian government, whoever is in charge of that government, when it comes to food aid. A lot of it is done through the World Food Program. Much of that aid is American aid. So I would just like to underscore that I think the United States will do that again should the need arise. And I think other countries will do the same, European Union countries particularly. They have perhaps less food aid to make available, but they do have financial resources in order to buy food aid to send in. So I think you will see a good response from the international community when it comes to humanitarian aid once you get the humanitarian aid organizations into Tigray. That's the first obstacle.
If I could just add something here. I think what's happening now is exactly the same what happened back in the 80s, mainly because even back then when Dark was in power during Haile Selassie and what have you, Tigray faced so many famines, as Samuel said earlier, not because there wasn't anything to eat in Tigray, but mainly because the crops and the food was destroyed by invading forces. And the same thing is happening right now. The Tigrayan people are some of the hardworking people you could ever find, and over the past 30 years, all the developmental gains that they were able to achieve have been destroyed in the past 96 days, mainly by Eritrean troops and also Ethiopian forces. So food has been weaponized. Like hunger is being used as a weapon of distraction and extermination, and that's why you see Tigrayans starving today. Like as stated earlier, 4.5 million Tigrayans are facing an engineered famine. That's not because they don't work hard. It's not because they haven't had enough to eat. It's mainly because their food and crops has been destroyed, mainly because the intention of all this war is to bring Tigrayans back to absolute poverty so that they don't get to think about anything else but their day-to-day survival. So what I wanted to highlight here is unless the international community steps up its efforts into pushing, the invading forces into opening Tigray, we very well know that they're not going to let any aid workers enter into Tigray. In the midst of all of this, innocent lives are going to lose. We have been hearing stories how children are dying in their bed while sleeping because they're starving to that extent. So the similarity is very striking in a way how food. How blocking food and hunger is being used as a weapon of distraction, as a weapon of extermination, and the international community, by babysitting forces that are making this possible, are letting the Tigrayan people down. Just like how the international community laid the people in Rwanda back in the early 90s, I feel like as a Tigrayan, the international community is letting the Tigray people down too, because in my opinion, the invading forces are being emboldened by the inaction of the international community. I understand there are a lot of issues involved. I know it's not as clear as it sounds. I know intervening, pushing pressure may not come that naturally. However, the Tigrayan people do not have time to wait. Like Tigray literally cannot wait because innocent lives are dying. So unless we do something collectively, innocent lives will perish, and there will come a time where we would say, we could have done this, we should have done that, in order to prevent the perishing of innocent lives. So the famine is literally about to wipe an entire community because we're not taking the appropriate measures.
Thank you all for touching on that, especially because some people may not be aware of the history of famine in Tigray. The next question is for Ambassador Shin. You served as U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1998 during the outbreak of the border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. From your perspective, can you shed light on the situation, what the situation was like on the ground? And do you see any parallels between the 98 border conflict and the current conflict today?
I think there are more differences than similarities when you compare the situation from 1998 to 2000, which was the period of the actual war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the situation today. The devastation that you see today is heavily inside Tigray, and it's largely affecting the civilian community, the non-military component in Tigray. If you look at the situation in 1998 to 2000, relatively few civilians on both sides of the border were negatively impacted. Some were. Immediately along the border, there was hardship. There's no doubt about that. But the numbers were quite small. The people who were mainly harmed in that were actually military personnel. There was something in the vicinity of almost 100,000 military personnel killed on both sides of that border during that 2-year period of time. I don't know what the number of civilians was that you would say had died as a result of the conflict, but the number would be much, much smaller than that. So you also had a situation where the two countries were literally at war, whereas today the two countries are allied, and you have actually had Eritrean forces come into Tigray. Whether they came in on their own, whether they were invited, I have no idea. But I think the evidence is very compelling that they did enter Tigray, and they certainly were not told to leave at a minimum. So that too is a very different situation than you had in the 98 to 2000 period. As I say, I think there are far more differences than there are similarities in the two situations. The key here is, how is this all going to end up? What is going to be the nature of the Ethiopian-Eritrean relationship when this is all resolved and Tigray can return to some sense of normality? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's going to be very interesting how this plays out in the future, and what the impact will be on relations not only between Asmara and Addis Ababa on the one hand, but relations along the border on the other.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Before we move on to the next question, Getachew or any of our other panelists, would you like to add on to any differences or similarities you see between what's going on today and the 98 border conflict?
Okay, thank you. What I want to add somewhat is, so the conflicts have, or the war have their own some similarities, but mostly differences, as Ambassador David Shin stated. But what I want to focus more is, so this war is, like, for the people of Tigray, one of the most difficult civil wars in our history, I could say. I have read a lot of books, history books, but when I look at the actors of the war, there are almost two countries, or I could say some other countries as well, but most of the facts that are coming, or the information that we are getting from Tigray, is that Ethiopia and Eritrea, with their heavily armed mechanized forces, are in Tigray, on top of the the militias, the paramilitary forces, and the vigilante groups. So in many ways, this war is completely on the ground all over Tigray, even in the very remote areas of, in the very remote village areas of Tigray. So there are large or great differences from that, 1998 up to 2000 Ethiopia-Eritrea war. So what I want to add briefly is, this war is touching, the life of the society directly, either it could be in the rural areas or in urban areas, even in very remote areas of, the region or the Tigray area. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is also about the border war. This one reads, when the 1998 border war occurred, Ethiopians were upset by the conflict and were fervently against the killing of Tigrayans. Yet today we are more divided than ever on this war. What do you attribute on the current war, meaning? What do you attribute to this type of response? What is the difference between then and now? And Maza, if you want to respond first.
I think back in the 98 war, there was a sense of solidarity because as Ethiopians, we all felt that our sovereignty was under attack, that our territorial integrity was infringed. And hence, I feel like Ethiopians all from all walks of life came together. Although I was very young and I barely remember what exactly happened, but from reading history books and from listening to political leaders, what I understand is that was coming to compromise the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ethiopia. However, after that, there has been a massive campaign targeting Tigrayans and their government. There has been a massive campaign aimed at dehumanizing Tigrayans. And so now, like, a Tigrayan's life doesn't mean nothing to most Ethiopians. I'm afraid to say that, but that's the reality on the ground. You would see a lot of people concerned about the well-being of a person who is from far land. That by in itself is not a bad thing. But if you're concerned about a civilian's life, and let's say in Syria or in Yemen, you ought to be concerned about the life of your own fellow citizen, a Tigrayan person. But because of the massive dehumanization of Tigrayans that has been employed by, Abiy Ahmed's regime and even previous governments, Tigrayans have been painted as if the people that do not necessarily wish the well-being and coexistence of Ethiopia. And everything that you're seeing right now is a result of that. There has been a massive amount of hate campaign targeting Tigrayans, and that took away the humanity of Tigrayans. And so Tigrayan suffering doesn't necessarily mean anything to most Ethiopians. That's why you see them either denying the existence of the war or trying to compromise and undermine the impact that it's having on Tagaru people. I think that's the main difference. In my opinion, back then we were focused on maintaining our collective existence. Now it's all about exterminating the people of Tigray, and that's why we say this is a genocidal war.
Thank you.
Let me add, since I may be the only person on the panel who was actually living in Ethiopia at the time of the outbreak of the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. I would certainly agree that that war did result in a sort of a unification of Ethiopians against what they perceived to be the foreign invader. And it happened at a time when the EPRDF was in charge, when the TPLF was seen as the key actor in the EPRDF. And that was very controversial. I must be very frank about this. There were a lot of concerns in Ethiopia about the role that the TPLF was playing in government. But what the war did was to basically sublimate or to overcome, at least temporarily, unhappiness aimed at Tigrayans or the TPLF, and it brought people together. And that held up throughout the war period itself from 1998 to 2000, and perhaps lasted for a short period thereafter. When you look at the current situation and compare it, it's totally different. You've had a period of a year or two prior to the outbreak of conflict in November of last year, where the TPLF basically returned to Tigray. It had effectively lost its position in the EPRDF, had migrated, most of the leadership migrated back to Tigray, and a great deal of animosity had developed in this past year or two. And as a result, the atmosphere in the country generally is very, very different. And it tends to be a more hostile approach towards Tigray region, Tigrayans, and certainly towards the TPLF.
Just to add on to that, the role of state media back then and now is very pivotal. In the 1998-2000 war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, state media played a crucial role in unifying Ethiopians. Whether it was through reporting or through songs and documentaries and other propaganda, there was a lot that happened at that time that sort of brought people together, to Ambassador Shin's point, despite whatever differences may have been before 1998. Also, I mean, if you're Tigrayan, you'll never forget June 5th, 1998, when Eritrean Air Force bombed Eider Elementary School in Mekelle. That's something that we'll never forget. And where dozens of children and adults died because of 2 cluster bombs. One flew in over Mekelle, dropped a bomb at the school, and then flew back and then dropped another one. So we'll never forget that. And I think because of that shock that occurred, and it shocked not only Tigrayans, but Ethiopians as a whole, and Africans and the world, people were united. They saw it, as Mazda said, really an infringement on Ethiopian territorial integrity. Ethiopian territorial integrity is being infringed upon again, but this time with the government cooperating with Eritrea in many ways. And we've seen this over the last 2-3 years, beginning with Isaias Afwerki, the dictator of Eritrea, saying game over TPLF. That's sort of how he characterized the signing of an agreement between Asmara and Addis Ababa, an agreement which no one has read. We don't know what they signed. The Ethiopian parliament never ratified anything. But somehow the Prime Minister of Ethiopia received a Nobel Prize for an agreement that no one ever read. And so, not to mention the border was never demarcated either. So it just makes you wonder, what was the fighting actually about? But now Ethiopian state media is actively contributing to the fragmentation of the country. Over the last 2.5 years, they've created all sorts of documentaries blaming Tigrinya speakers for the country's problems and calling Tigrayans daytime hyenas. That's how Tigrayans are sort of known or classified. And when you name people in that way, it reminds me of cockroaches in Rwanda. It reminds me of other sort of slangs and insults that we've seen throughout the world. And Maza's correct. When you dehumanize a people, it is very easy to justify any sort of attacks upon them. And so the role of state media here has been very troublesome when it comes to hate speech, genocidal rhetoric. When you think about some of the officials in the Ethiopian federal government, and then also within the Amhara state government, some of the officials in Bahar Dar have said some extraordinarily inflammatory things before and during the war. And this is problematic, at a time when leaders should be finding pathways for dialogue and de-escalation. The government, and particularly through state media, is actually contributing actively to inflammatory rhetoric. And this is how you see the United Nations Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide has issued, at least by my count, 2 or 3 statements between November and now, one that happened just a few days ago, talking about the ethnic tensions and the violence and the allegations of international human rights violations and humanitarian law violations, not just in Tigray either, but throughout the country. And so we need to take a look at the role of state media in destabilizing not only Tigray, but also in sort of allowing for hate to proliferate.
Thank you all for shedding light on that. We also wanted to switch gears and go into some questions that were received by the attendees. So this is a personal question from an individual who signed up for this event. So I'm going to be reading it in her voice. I would like to understand more about the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, particularly from the perspective of the Tigrayan people. I've noticed that my parents have a very different perspective of the situation from what I've seen from the Tigrayan activists online. So I'd like to get more insight. How can we ensure that we receive unbiased and evidence-based reflection of the situation on the ground? And that's a question for anyone.
Okay, it's a good question. And but not clear, because there are many Tigrayan activists. But I will try to respond as much as possible. So from the very beginning, when this war started, I was observing, the opinion of the public, because as I was, opposing TPLF from the very beginning, and I use Twitter or Facebook. So when the war started, I start writing about the war. I start voicing, plight of the people. But immediately, I got the label junta, like the other folks, or your TPLF. So what I'm trying to analyze here is the information that we are getting from Tigray has its own limitations because of the total shutdown. But for sure, for example, when I talk about the massacre around, it could be in the eastern part of Tigray, when the 154, Tigrayans murdered by the Eritrean forces, or when I talk some other, incidents in Tigray, there might some, little differences in the numbers, but most of them, for example, when we talk about the internal, displacement, or it could be the, people who need urgent humanitarian reliefs, these are, most of them, I could say, verified by or attested by, the humanitarian organization groups, or even the government itself. So I don't get, there could be, I should say, there could be exaggerated, sometimes informations, because it's the social media. There is tension, in the community. We are sleepless. But also I have observed that we Tigrayans are, expected to provide different or special standard of proof, for the ongoing conflict in Tigray, even if there are, mounting evidences of extrajudicial killings, even, not presented by Tigrayans, but some of them by even independent journalists, like, AFP or the New York Times, or and others. So what I want, to focus here is that the Tigrayan activists should not be, demanded to provide special standard of proof for all what we are speaking. And I don't want to say most of them, but some of what you call the Ethiopian activists, especially pro-government pundits, try to label every Tigrayan as, part and parcel of TPLF, and they want to demolish, the credibility of, the evidences that are coming from Tigray. And so the government or pro-government pundits from the very beginning, tried to cover up. When they couldn't, they denied. When they couldn't deny, they own and try to undermine, every case of, either the humanitarian crisis or the extrajudicial, executions, even the sexual assault. I hope Maza will shed light on more on the, sexual assault. So, yeah, I need to say this. Thank you.
If I may just add, I think Getachew has already answered the first part of the question, but the next part is for anyone who wants to know the truth and who has a problem with Tigrayan activists amplifying what exactly is happening on the ground. I think the right thing to do and the ultimate solution is to open the humanitarian corridor, to open Tigray to international independent journalists so that they could go there, assess the level of destruction, the level of humanitarian crisis, and everything that has happened ever since the war was waged against the people of Tigray on November 4th. Then we wouldn't have even to battle facts. We wouldn't even have to argue whether, what I tweet, what Getachew tweets, or what someone else tweets is a fact or otherwise. So anyone who has a problem in accepting what the people of Tigray are saying to be true should put pressure on Abiy Ahmed and his cronies to open Tigray. Then we'll have an independent group of investigators who are going to look into everything that has, transpired in the past 96 days, and then we'll be able to see the fact for what it is. But what I want to add here is, like, as Getachew said, every Tigrayan voice is labeled as a junta or TPLF, and so by implication there comes the effort to discredit Tigrayan voices and to silence us. And I feel like this is an attempt. It's an attempt at silencing concerned voices so that dictatorial regimes could continue to exterminate a group of people unbothered. And all of this effort, it's coordinated. It's not just individuals. It's not just ordinary citizens, calling out Tigrayan activists, giving them names and trying to discredit their voices. It's an order that directly came from the unelected prime minister from Addis. Abiy Ahmed issued a letter calling on the diaspora community to go on, a parade of spreading false rumors and discrediting valid points, valid concerns that were being brought into the global community's attention by Tigrayan voices. So the ultimate solution here is opening Tigray, allowing access to international journalists and independent investigators so that they could go on the ground and see what exactly is happening. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with my fellow Tigrayans. The reality is Tigrayans of all stripes, no matter what your political opinions are, everybody's united. We're seeing this, even the leading opposition parties in Tigray have issued statements opposing this war, calling it for what it is. Tigrayans of all, there are numerous Tigrayans abroad that have been sort of exiled or self-exiled over the last 3 decades and have more than a grudge with the TPLF, who are all standing side by side. So, none of us buy that this is some sort of rule of law operation, whatever. We don't buy the propaganda. We know what this is about. And it's really sad and embarrassing that anybody and everybody who has anything critical to say about this war is somehow being bought and paid for by the TPLF. Including the New York Times and the Economist. If that's true, then I'm impressed at TPLF's ability to buy the whole world off. But even Ambassadors Brazil and Schinner being attacked for being on this panel today, which I think is just ridiculous. If you truly have nothing to hide, prove it. It's that simple. Prove it. Bring international investigators in, an independent international investigation into what happened in Maikadra, where some reports say up to 600 people died. The fact of the matter is people died, and their families need answers. They need justice, and all of us need justice, because everything that has happened since November requires a lot of probing, and we owe it to the Tigrayan people, to the Ethiopian people, to have answers. And again, I'll just go back to the fact that the Ethiopian government is trying so hard to silence anything that opposes its narrative. There are, about 10 journalists in Ethiopia that are arrested, some that are being held for terrorism charges for reporting on this war. That's like, at an extreme example, sort of, if you arrested Barbara Walters in the United States for interviewing the leader of North Korea or something, like, that's just ridiculous. Like, journalists, their job is to investigate things, and their job is to question things, and it's to seek the truth, no matter where it goes. And it's integral to democracy to have a marketplace of ideas and views. And so that there are ridiculous assertions that journalists are somehow terrorists for reporting on the facts or interviewing the president of Tigray is just ridiculous. They're doing their job. We saw that the Reuters correspondent in Ethiopia had their press pass revoked. The International Crisis Group's Ethiopia analyst was deported, and BBC and Deutsche Welle were both issued warnings by the Ethiopian government. Not to mention, here in the United States, Voice of America's Amharic program continues to be one of the leading sources of hate speech and genocidal rhetoric, awkwardly funded by American taxpayer dollar. So, that's something that I hope the United States Congress looks at a little bit closely, because Congress does appropriate Voice of America's funding. And so, my hope is that people understand it's not just Tigrayans saying, oh, there's a humanitarian crisis. In fact, forget what Tigrayans are saying. The United Nations is saying this. The International Red Cross, late November, issued a dispatch from Aider Hospital that directly countered Abi's narrative on what was going on in Mekelle. The siege on Mekelle, he said, was bloodless. That's not true. International Red Cross had issued a dispatch that angered the Ethiopian government, where they said that there were victims that were there because of trauma. There were victims there that were there because of violence, and so we need to be able to have a full accounting of what happened. And it's very important that the international community and journalists, Ethiopian journalists, and then also Western journalists, are able to do their job. Like the quickest way to end this is to have folks in to assess the facts, and that the Ethiopian government is trying so hard to prevent that from happening. That should raise a red flag.
Thank you so much. This second question builds off of that a little bit, but focuses more on reconciliation and collective healing. So bear with us. Many Ethiopians have deep emotional scars from the EPRDF's rule and are skeptical of the current media coverage, as they see that some of those active in the social media campaigns are supporters of the former government who committed atrocities against other Ethiopians in the past. How do we reconcile this and move towards collective healing? So similar, but a little bit different with regards to reconciliation and collective healing as Ethiopians or Horners.
Let me open with that. This is a very important issue, and it goes far beyond Tigray. We're all focusing on Tigray today because that's been the subject that was essentially laid out for us to talk about. But the ethnic conflicts that have been going on in Ethiopia for quite some period of time and have become more severe in the last couple of years, but all need to be reconciled going forward. And I'm talking about minority communities in Benishangul, for example, that have been attacked and where minorities have been killed. I'm talking about divisions in Oromia. I'm talking about earlier conflicts involving Somalis and Afars. This is a countrywide problem, not just a Tigrayan problem. And it's critical, in my view, that going forward, there be investigations of all of these episodes, certainly the recent ones, in Tigray and elsewhere, and that there be accountability when there are human rights violations or abuses, whoever happens to be at fault. There just has to be accountability. In terms of the immediate problem in Tigray, the United Nations, for example, could authorize a fact-finding commission of its own. They have the capacity to do that. They have the authority to do that if they can get the permission of the Ethiopian government. And it need not necessarily be confined just to Tigray. It perhaps could look at some of these other areas in Ethiopia that have been troubled in the last year or two. But I think a clear, independent investigation and accountability is really essential to move forward. And until you have that, I'm not sure you're going to have a solution to the current problems in Ethiopia today.
If I could build on what Ambassador David Shin said, and I don't want to be overly simplistic, but it seems to me that historically in Ethiopia, there's always, there continues to be a debate between how to self-govern, between those who see a strong central government coming out of the capital, ruling the country, perhaps by fiat, and those who argue for sort of a decentralized system that, as far as I know, is still enshrined in the Constitution in terms of regional governments having more of a say in what they can do. And there seems to be that debate and tension between those two visions. And by broadening out the issue, perhaps it can leach out some of the emotion from what is going on and give a way for people to begin to talk to each other at that level, and then get down to more specifics. But I agree with Ambassador Shin that there should be accountability, as we are struggling to have it here at home ourselves.
If I may go, reconciliation is very important. But as a Tigrayan, I feel disheartened that we're even talking about it as Tigrayans are continuing to be killed at the moment. I think we're at a place where we should focus on saving innocent lives first. Let's put the fire out first. And then after that, maybe we can look into ways of coming together, and maybe if it's ever possible. Because as a Tigrayan, it's really hard for me to forgive and let go what exactly is happening right now, because this is not the first time. Previously, during previous regimes, Tigrayans have been subjected to the same kind of violence, the same kind of weaponized hunger, weaponized rape, and what have you. So, but particularly during the Derg era, after the downfall of Derg era, Tigrayans, alongside other ethnic groups in Ethiopia, they found a way to coexist. And that was ethnic federalism, a sort of governance system that lets people to coexist in their own identity without having to compromise who they are as a group of people. And with that came the constitutional right of, the right self-administration. However, that right continues to be undermined by people who ought to be the majority and who ought to be the supreme leaders of Ethiopia, so to speak. So unless people recognize this inherent rights of ethnic groups, the right self-administer themselves, I don't think we will ever be able to coexist in Ethiopia. As a Tigrayan, I am hurt. I am deeply pained because I continue to be the target of violence just merely because I came from a certain group of people. And so until people realize the wrong in doing all of this and they recognize me for who I am as a person, I'm speaking just as Maza representing the people of Tigray, I don't think we would be able to see, a process where Tigrayans will be able to forgive and let go what is exactly happening to their people and reconcile. So the first thing is, let's all come together as Ethiopians. If there is indeed an identity called Ethiopian, let's all come together, see the wrong in, ravaging Tigrayan cities and region and villages with warplanes that are not only sponsored by the Ethiopian government, but also by, the Arab Emirates and Eritrean troops. Let's all come together. Let's stop that. And after that, maybe we can talk about how we can move forward. But unless I see other Ethiopians, stepping up and do the right thing, it's really hard for me to see, a time where I would be able to sit and talk about reconciliation. And one thing I wanted to mention is it's very important for the international community to recognize that almost all of members of the current administration are people that were members of the previous administration. The only change you see is name. That's it. If you're blaming the previous administration, like EPRD, for all sorts of, crimes and bad things that have happened in the past 27 years, you ought to admit that you're actually the ones that you're celebrating right now are the very people who committed the same crime. So let's not cherry pick. Let's focus on what's important. And in my opinion, it is putting the fire out, saving innocent Tigrayan lives that are being exterminated in the dark. And after that, we can talk about next steps, including reconciliation. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I like to remind people that Abiy was the co-founder and director general of Ethiopia's cyber intelligence agency, the Information Network Security Agency. There are 3 intelligence chiefs in Ethiopia: the head of cyber intelligence, the head of the National Intelligence and Security Service, NIS, and then the head of the federal police. In 2018, when there was a changing of leadership at the EPRDF, Getachew Asefa, a Tigrayan, became an outcast as the director of NIS, the director general of NIS. Workene, the director general of the federal police, is now the executive secretary of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. which is the Horn of Africa regional bloc. And then Abiy, who was at a time the Director General of INSA, is now Prime Minister. So, you know, these three officials would have presumably acted in concert together, you know, for any atrocities of the past. And so I fully agree with Maza there that, you know, if EPRDF is to be blamed for anything, then everybody at the helm, and I know many of these ministers at the helm, people that you see on TV, many of these people I've known for 15 years, are definitely guilty of said crimes as well. So, you know, but without even going there, 5 things that I really see as needing to happen, sort of, you know, first and most importantly, as we've already talked about, is humanitarian access, unfettered humanitarian access. That is the single most important thing right now, because the other statistic that we've neglected to mention is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, estimates that there are about 2.3 million children who are at risk of starvation. You know, so that alone, you know, these are children. They're not combatants. They're not this. They're not that. They're children. So that's important. Secondly, I think, and this is sort of the path to reconciliation, to answer your question. Secondly, is a complete withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Tigray. That's a precondition. I mean, you cannot. The Ethiopian territorial integrity has been breached. That is problematic. You know, and it's even more confusing. You know, I've had conversations with Ambassador Brazil in the past where, you know, you've talked to me about how how is it that you get to an Ethiopian by pulling on their heartstrings, and one of the ways is by talking about principles and territorial integrity and sovereignty, and sort of, you know, the pride that Ethiopians have as being the only country in Africa never to be colonized, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's true, inviting a foreign entity to attack your own people, I don't know where that falls in there. So that's important. Thirdly is as Ambassador Shin said, investigation, complete investigation, wherever it leads, an investigation of all war crimes, alleged war crimes and international human rights violations is very important, including the religious and historical sites. And I single that out in particular just because part of why we're calling this a genocide is not only do we argue that the Tigrayan people are being starved and wiped out, but their culture, our identity, our history is also being wiped out, which is deeply concerning. Fourthly, is a restoration of the government of Tigray. This is incredibly important. Tigrayans have their own government, and the idea that Abiy can install a puppet government in Mekelle is not going to work. It's never going to work. Tigrayans are, you know, self-determination is incredibly important to Tigrayans, to other Ethiopians as well, for sure. But to Tigrayans, you know, and just in the past century alone, you've seen in the 1940s and again in the 1970s, Tigrayans have had no problem standing up and fighting centralized rule, as Ambassador Brazil mentioned. You know, when it comes to this sort of push and pull between sort of a more unitary government, a centralized government that's based in Addis Ababa, that is indeed ruling by force and fiat, but then also this sort of more federated structure that allows people to self-govern. This was discussed and debated in the 1990s in Ethiopia. And as much as people may argue that the TPLF imposed multinational federalism on Ethiopia, the reality is that that's not the case, because there were a lot of other liberation fronts and secessionist movements that were ready to walk away. They were ready to balkanize Ethiopia. Ethiopia could have separated in significant ways in 1991, and that it was held together through a covenant, right? People came together and they said, okay, we're going to be part of this thing called Ethiopia. We want an exit ticket called Article 39. In case we don't like things, we will secede. In that respect, Ethiopia seems more like a confederation to me than a federation, but ultimately respecting. And this was the first time that it was written in Ethiopian law, right? Ethiopian history goes back thousands of years. The first time written in Ethiopian law that the people of Ethiopia, the nations, nationalities, and people had the right to protect their identity, their language, their history, the right to speak their language. When we talk about Ethiopia, we always focus on the Amharas, the Tigrayans, and the Oromos, and we forget that there are dozens of other ethnic groups in the country, oftentimes who sit in the periphery, who sit in the margins. And I agree with Ambassador Shin. So if you're talking about ethnic reconciliation and sort of a truth and reconciliation process, you cannot do it just with Abiy and the TPLF or the Prosperity Party and the TPLF. That's ridiculous. And this is actually something to their credit. TPLF showed remarkable strength, in my opinion, over the last 2-3 years by demanding a national inclusive dialogue, because the reality is, even if the TPLF and the Prosperity Party were to find a way to work together, that doesn't solve the larger problem at hand in terms of uniting Ethiopia and creating a system that works for all Ethiopians, regardless of what people choose. People in Ethiopia need the opportunity to decide that for themselves. It's not my responsibility, and none of us on this panel, it's not our responsibility to prescribe that for them. Our responsibility is to fight for an inclusive dialogue that will allow them to decide for themselves how they wish to be governed. And so restoring the government of Tigray is incredibly important, because the Tigrayan people should decide who governs them, not Addis Ababa. And so that's a fourth important point to mention. And then the fifth one, in terms of a roadmap for the future, first and foremost, releasing all political prisoners, including journalists. There are a number of political prisoners in Ethiopia that are unjustly incarcerated. Many also are incarcerated without any official charge, which is a violation of their constitutional right to due process in Ethiopia. And so releasing political prisoners is going to be very important. Secondly, a national inclusive dialogue needs to take place with a specific timetable and with very specific deliverables, including who is going to sort of be in charge of this dialogue process, and sort of what entity is that going to look like. Is this a transitional government, which I would argue for? Is this something else? I think in many respects, Ethiopia does need to hit the pause button, possibly the reset button, and rethink sort of the future. And then most importantly, it's important that Ethiopia does not rush into elections, that Ethiopia's prime minister thinks that he can have an election in June to legitimize his rule. I think is ridiculous. Not to mention, first and foremost, there hasn't been a census conducted in Ethiopia since 2007. And the 2007 census numbers are highly disputed by everybody. And so the census was supposed to occur in 2017. It hasn't, and it's been continuously postponed. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed first and foremost, because not only do the seats of the lower house of People's Representatives need to be redistricted, but the upper house of the Federation is apportioned by the amount of by the population of each nation and nationality in Ethiopia. So you can't have an upper house of the Federation without knowing how many people live in a particular ethnic group to adequately represent them in parliament. And so an election is premature in that sense. And then also, it doesn't solve for the internally displaced people, and it doesn't solve for the massive sort of constitutional crisis that's being that is occurring in Ethiopia. So to your credit, Ambassador Shin, you said this in 2019 at a panel at the U.S. Institute of Peace, that an election in 2020 probably also was premature. And I would agree that Ethiopia needs to focus on its ABCs before it goes to a Z, because my fear is that this election is going to be purely cosmetic, and it's going to try to help Abiy solidify his rule over the country without having gone through the necessary grunt work of building a democracy.
Thank you. Thanks for that extensive breakdown, Samuel. We're going to move into geopolitics, but again, definitely want to acknowledge that this is a very complicated issue, and there have been multiple conflicts throughout the country, not just in Tigray, but we are focusing on Tigray today because that is, as Maza said, that's where the fire is. So next question, can you speak to the geopolitical dynamics of this conflict? Who has to gain, who has to lose, who are the international actors, and will the aftermath of this conflict lead to any change in existing geopolitical partnerships? And maybe we want to start with one of the ambassadors, perhaps Ambassador Brazil.
I was going to suggest Ambassador Shin.
We can do that too.
All right. David, over to you.
Yeah, you like to pass off the hard ones, don't you, Ray? Yeah. Basically, I would only make one comment on this, and it's the same comment that I have made since this conflict broke out on November 3. I mean, the legs to the conflict predate November 3, but that's sort of the proximate date for the actual conflict between authorities in Tigray and the government in Addis Ababa. And my comment has consistently been that what happens in Tigray depends upon the will of the Tigrayan people. It does not depend upon the TPLF. I don't care what happens, quite frankly, to the TPLF. I have no dog in that fight. But it is important that the Tigrayan people, at least as a majority, hopefully a large majority, can determine the outcome of what they want for their region. I would hope that that would include continued unification with the rest of Ethiopia. I am worried when I see continuing, increasingly large numbers of Tigrayans who are whispering the idea of independence or breaking away or balkanization. I totally disagree with that. I'm an outsider. I have no say in it. I understand that. But you've asked for my opinion, and so I'm giving it. I think it's important to maintain the unity of Ethiopia within its current borders. And I realize those borders have changed over the centuries. They're not in concrete. But I think that it's important that they continue as they are, but it's equally important that the Tigrayan people determine their own future, and without respect to what the political situation has been in the past. And I'll just leave it there.
If I could add, when I arrived in Ethiopia, I had the opportunity to travel to every part of Ethiopia. And under the constitution that existed when I was there, that gave the ethnic regionalism aspects. And what I heard in most of the regions I traveled to, people were beginning to appreciate the fact that they had control over their own situation, that they could speak up on budget matters. They could get monies from the central government and spend it the way that they wanted to, as the people dictated in that area. So I went to Benishangul Gumuz. I've been to Afar, I've been to Gambela, I've been to Tigray many times, Afar. So that all of the area, Somali area, people appreciated that flexibility that they were beginning to realize and beginning to organize around, organize their social, civic, and political lives around. I don't know what will happen, but there are issues that have to be settled in some kind of national dialogue. At the moment, in Tigray, so the people of each region have to decide, as far as I can see. But it's something for Ethiopia to determine. But I know that at least for African Americans in the United States and Ethiopia, we have had a long association. You cannot go to any African American community in this country and not find an Abyssinian Baptist church because Ethiopia was called Abyssinia. We took heart as African Americans in this country. We took heart from the fact that Ethiopia had never been colonized. We took heart from the fact that that African Americans have gone to Ethiopia and helped Ethiopia in its time of need in world wars, and in sending teachers and having relationships. So there's a sense, I think, at least in the community that I'm part of in the United States, that a unified, territorially integrated Ethiopia is important. And Tigray has played a role in that for a long time. So I personally hope that the country remains unified, but I can't dictate outcomes.
Thank you. And Getachew, earlier you spoke to the human costs of this war. Can you speak to the migration trends as a result of this war, with both respect to internally displaced people and cross-border refugees that are Ethiopian and Eritrean?
Okay, thank you. If I may, I need to take 1 minute to talk about the most probably about the issue of Tigrayan independence, or about the the essence of the unification. So I don't know how to express. I don't know how to explain it, but I think it was before almost 1 year, or 1 year and 5 months. I wrote an article, a very brief article, about independence. As there are some, Tigrayans who are interested in independence. We are also Tigrayans who are highly interested in Ethiopia. It was a matter of fact, before the war started. But after the war, I don't know, as a reasonable person, especially as a reasonable educated Tigrayan elite, when I look at all what you call the state structure, especially the elite, the Ethiopian elite, the religious institutions, do not hear our pain. I don't know how to explain it, but I am, tragic optimist. I would be happy if, our Ethiopian fellow brothers and sisters could listen the pain of the Tigrayans. I'm talking about the civilians, not the PLF, the civilians, and do not undermine, their grief, their pains. And the way how, the Prime Minister is trying to solve the, problem in Tigray by imposing, his own, people. It's a bit difficult, for unification. So I hope, I don't know. I want to echo Maaza's statement. Actually, there are a lot of things right now going on. It's not, what you call it, time to talk about independence at this time, but I believe it is flourishing. There would be, there will be times, in the future, I believe. So to speak about the migration problems, let me start by the internal displacement problems. One of, I could say, the least, focused challenges right now in Tigray is, especially in the western part of Tigray, there are almost about, I could say, around 1 million people who have been displaced, from their homes. As we all know, there are claims regarding the, plots of land, or I could say the lands, the areas around Welgai, in the other areas of Raya. Very shockingly, like almost up to 500, up to 600,000 residents of the western, especially I'm talking about the northwestern, the Welgai areas, have been relocated or have been, forced to leave their homes. They don't have anything in their hands. The regional administration, the Amhara regional administration, has started administrating the region, they are trying to mobilize, new settlers to the region. So either the IDPs or we have also around 66,000 refugees in Sudan. When I read their pains, their anguish, they don't have anything in their hands. Not only that, most of them are victims of either any kind of human rights violations. It could be sexual assault or some kind of humanitarian violations. So it's very grave. But on top of that, what's aching or what's very painful is the denial. The prime minister, I don't know even how to say it sometimes because it's very painful. He gave a press release on the TV live. He said, my military has not killed a single civilian, anyone. There are also not any women or children refugees in Sudan. So what I need to conclude by saying is either the internal displacement or the refugee problem is creating not only the visible problems but also what you call challenging socioeconomic problems that would last long for years, not months or whatever, but for many years. I could say for a couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Getachew. Does somebody else, one of the other panelists, want to touch base on the question regarding the migration trends as a result of the war, and specifically the fate of Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees who are in Sudan or are internally displaced within the region, before we move on to the next question?
Can I address that, but also go back to the geopolitical question a little bit? Is that okay? Great. So with regards to the geopolitical question first, what scares me is just how increasingly militarized the Horn of Africa is, and how incredibly violent that region has been for the last century, and this new sort of what I would call an unholy alliance between Isaias Abiy and President Farmajo of Somalia. And so I see those three men as being incredibly destabilizing to the region. And it is my hope that the United States can take, now under President Biden, can take a more proactive role in that region and pushing for peace, security, and democracy and respective fundamental human rights. And so, this is something that a lot of folks in Washington and elsewhere have been advocating for, and certainly I have as well, is appointing a special envoy for the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea as somebody sort of at a very high level in the United States to be similar to what the European Union has, a point person to coordinate across countries, across borders, across regions, who understands the region and who can help push for peace and security. And so I think that's super important just from the beginning, because what we're seeing right now, and this goes back to Ambassador Brazil's point about peacekeepers, is what scares me about this war and why I think it's going to be very hard to end, even if there was a ceasefire today, is just how bad it is, in the sense of, you see in addition to Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries, you're also seeing sort of the reemergence of long-held territorial disputes between Tigray and Amhara. And that is resulting in violence, and it will continue to result in violence. And so, I mean, I really think that there should be peacekeepers in those border areas between Tigray and Amhara to prevent further mass atrocities like what we saw in Maikadra. We need to know what happened, but we also need to sort of have a buffer so that none of that happens again. We're seeing parts of Tigray, southern and western Tigray, that are being administered now, effectively annexed by the Amhara regional government. And then there are parts of northern Tigray where there are credible claims that parts of northern Tigray are being effectively managed by the government of Eritrea. And so the territorial integrity of Tigray, let alone the entirety of Ethiopia, is in jeopardy. And so that needs to be addressed. Again, before there's any dialogue or before there's anything that needs to be addressed first and foremost. This is not a war for independence. Tigrayans are not secessionists. Yes, there are minor political parties in Tigray, including the Tigray Independence Party, that may be advocating for secession, but even they are advocating it through legal means. No one in Tigray is advocating for violent secession. But I do fear that the longer this war continues, the more sentiment will increase among Tigrayans that maybe we are better apart. And that would break my heart. I am Tigrayan, but as an American, I don't think that it's my say either. I'm living here thousands of miles away, and that decision should be left to my family in Tigray and the rest of the people in Tigray to decide their own future, regardless of the current politics, because we've seen political parties come and go, leaders have come and gone throughout the decades and centuries. What stays are the people, and so the priority is the people, not any single individual or entity. Just the only thing that I'll say with regards to the migration issue, my biggest concern is the forced repatriation of Tigrayan refugees from Sudan. That's my biggest concern. There are upwards to 60,000 plus Tigrayan refugees that have sought safety in Sudan, and we're seeing increased hostilities between Sudan and Ethiopia, including claims that Sudan has sort of taken over some territories that Ethiopia disputes and Sudan disputes, and so there's a lot of back and forth. But blood has been spilled. And my concern is just ensuring the safety of not only the people along the border communities, but also the safety of the Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. And this is something that I hope the United Nations and really the United States, now that it has normalized relations with Khartoum, can really focus on, because this is an area to watch.
Thank you, Samuel. I do want to note that we are at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and that is the time that our panelists have committed to staying with us for. So we do have about 4 more questions left, but I know that some of our panelists did mention that they need to leave right at 3 p.m. Eastern. So for those of you that do have to get off the call, we thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your experience and perspective. We truly, truly appreciate it. And so, hopefully in the future, we'll be able to speak with you again at another event, hopefully under more peaceful circumstances.
Thank you. And I have to leave. So I appreciate being included, and I'm sorry to miss the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brazil.
I thank you also. I also need to leave, and I just wish all of Ethiopia the very best, and hopefully a quick solution to what is going on in Tigray today, but also solutions to other parts of the country that are experiencing difficulties. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So we are getting many questions from the audience submitted via email. We thank you for all those questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them since we are limited on time, but we are going to try to get through a few here. And so this next question is, seeing that the government of Ethiopia is not permitting the UN to go in, My understanding of how the UN works is that it cannot go in without the government's approval. How can we save Tigrayans stuck in this crisis? If not the UN, who can go in without the approval of the Ethiopian government to bring peace and aid to the region? And who should we be focusing our efforts and worries to, since the UN has not taken concrete action?
I can try that. You know, with all African regional intergovernmental institutions proving to be incompetent, as some said earlier, I think the responsibility falls on UN. It's quite understandable that Ethiopia is not, it's a non-state actor. It's still a region within Ethiopia, and it may not necessarily have a direct representation within the UN. And so it may not necessarily, like UN cannot take action based on the collective action principle that all UN signatory countries are obliged to do. However, a genocide is happening. So when active genocide, a state-sponsored genocide is happening, the UN has a responsibility to protect. And so the call doesn't necessarily need to come from the Ethiopian region. The fact that, there are independently verified sources proving that innocent people are being massacred in masses is proof enough, it's a reason enough to initiate the principle of responsibility to protect and for UN to intervene. The intervention may not necessarily need to be militarily. If Abiy Ahmed and his cronies do listen to recommendations and suggestions that are being given by global leaders. But if it comes to it, the world shouldn't just sit idly by as innocent people are dying. So that's the first answer. But more so than the UN, particularly the UN members of Security Council, I think states have a role to play here. First of all, they need to defend the Tigrayan genocide that's happening. Not only states, but also in global financial institutions such as the World Bank and IMF. We just recently learned how Ethiopia has asked for debt relief, right? That shouldn't happen. We learned how the Eritrean government is said to receive some sort of aid from the World Bank. This kind of activities, this kind of decision should not be made as the money is being used to exterminate a group of ethnic minorities within the country. So I believe even if the UN is being very inactive and they're letting the people of Tigray down, I think states have a role to play, first of all, by recognizing the crisis for what it is, and that's Tigrayan genocide, and also to take concrete actions starting from putting sanctions, economic sanction, arms embargo, flight restriction, what have you, both on the Ethiopian government as well as the Eritrean government. And after that, UN is nothing but a collection of nations and states, right? So if states take the right direction in their prospective foreign policy towards Ethiopia, particularly with regards to the crisis in Tigray, I don't see any reason why the UN would resist that. But one important thing we all need to realize is how the notion of African problems should be resolved by Africans is becoming a problem in resolving the crisis, because we have seen African Union not only justifying the crisis in Ethiopia, in Tigray particularly, but supporting it by causing up to dictator Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki and not holding him accountable for all the alleged crimes against humanity and what crimes that are happening. So as Africans, and particularly descendants of the Horn, we need to realize that the regional intergovernmental institutions we have are not effective enough to handle the crisis that is unfolding on the ground, and hence we need international intervention, and that needs to come mainly from globalized countries independently, but also collectively through the UN members of states. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question has to deal with activism. So at the moment, Tigray relies heavily on social media campaigns to raise awareness of the crisis. What is the likelihood of these social media campaigns bringing concrete changes in Tigray?
Very much important, and they're very active. Social media activism by Tigrayans. I mean, we're not that many people. Let's just start there, right? There's not a lot of us at home or abroad, but that Tigrayans have been able to make noise, a lot of noise on social media, that's commendable. We're talking about diaspora Tagaro who may have different civic organizations or associations out there, but none that are sort of massively effective or well funded in the millions or whatever. We're not operating with a government abroad. We're not operating with an embassy or anything like that. And so for Tigrayans to have completely mobilized so quickly in the last 90 plus days, and really, and this is how important the point is, that this is not some insane law enforcement operation, but a war on Tigray and Tagaro is, there are a lot of diaspora Tagaro who have stayed away from Ethiopian politics and who have stayed away from anything sort of related to the homeland, who are now speaking up and stepping out in extraordinary ways. And so you see people feel compelled to act, and that's a beautiful thing. And the activism that we're seeing online, this isn't a disinformation campaign. This is fact-based. People are sounding the alarm. They're sharing articles, they're sharing insights, they're sharing news from back home, and they're sounding the alarm. And people are paying attention. Policymakers across the world, international organizations, and the UN get tagged in a lot of these different tweets and whatnot. And there's so many really great efforts out there where people are really trying to mobilize. You have the Defund Tigray Genocide movement, which is directly targeting Ethiopian Airlines as a state-owned enterprise, which is also complicit in the ethnic profiling and harassment of Tagaro, and so many of their captains and pilots and flight attendants and other staffers have been laid off or fired because of their identity. You have groups like Stand With Tigray, you have groups like Omna Tigray, and others that are forming across the world. You have the Tigray Youth Network in the United Kingdom, United Tagaro in Canada, United Tagaro in Australia, the Tigray Professionals Network, etc. I mean, the list goes down and down. And the beauty here is there's a multitude of ways to get involved, and people are organizing. There are protests happening, there are vigils happening. February 11th is the 100th day of the war. There will be a major protest at the United Nations headquarters in New York. There will be other activities and protests around the world. The hashtags, Stand With Tigray, hashtag Tigray Genocide, hashtag Stop War on Tigray. These are sort of three big ones that a lot of people are using, and it's beautiful to see. It's beautiful to see. And what I like the most is how many young folks have gotten involved, how many Gen Z Tagaro have gotten involved in the effort, how many women are involved in the effort, and then also the solidarity that we are seeing from some of our non-Tagaro Ethiopian brothers and sisters. It's not as much as we would like to see, but it does exist. We're seeing cross-ethnic solidarity, inter-ethnic solidarity, and my hope is that we'll see a bit more of that too. And then just very lastly, that we're seeing more and more high-profile individuals, decision makers, influencers that are stepping up and stepping out about this issue, tells you also how effective the digital campaigns have been. And again, this is about Tigray. This is about protecting the people of Tigray. This is about ending the war. And when you see the tweets that a lot of people are pushing out, or the posts on Facebook or Instagram, they're talking about the people.
If I may add some points. So I could say that digital activism is a new phenomenon for many Tigray youth, especially, and when I, talking about the youth. But in these 3 months, I have observed many, I could say, wonderful youth, sorry, who are working hard, to amplify the voice of the people. And at the same time, I need also to reiterate what I have said before. Because of the communication shutdown that is still persisting in Tigray, we might lack some videos, what you call, or pictures, whatever that could simply explain, the gravity of the humanitarian crisis. Yes, because that is, the government is trying to block any avenue of, information from the region. But at the same time, for example, when a given guy, a person, tweets, my mom has died, my sister has died, I don't even see how, individuals reply or, engage as a liar. I'm not saying, all of the what you call the Twitter pages are right, but most of them, especially with the pictures, they have their own pictures. They are, known in Facebook or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is, because of the communication shutdown, we are trying, to fill the gap by, simple data, like simple information. It could be the information that we have got, from our parents or from our friends through the phone or whatever. So, and I read that the government is trying to discredit, our voices daily by saying, every Tigrayan that is participating in social media is TPLF, whatever. But thanks to the Washington, I think it's Washington Post, they have made good, decent research on that. So the amount of disinformation, campaign or whatever it could be, especially in Twitter, is insignificant. So we need to work hard, because the gravity of the situation or the gravity of the humanitarian crisis, the extrajudicial killings, it's severe, but we couldn't get, as I said before, we couldn't get videos or pictures because of the communication shutdown. But we should continue, be voice to the people. And I honestly advise to, fellow Ethiopian sisters and brothers, there are two things that they could still help, or that they could be voice of, the society. One, they could pressure the government to open Tigray, to give access, and then we will see together, the facts on the ground. And second one, I don't know how to say it still, but the blanket denial that I am getting, from many Ethiopians, I could say, especially the elite one. They know the challenge, they know the gravity of the problem, but they are still directly or indirectly denying it. So I hope they would see something, from our today's discussion. And thank you.
Thank you so much. We are moving into our last two questions. We are running out of time, so we'll try to make these as quick as possible. The second last question is specifically for you, Maaza. So sexual violence is widespread in Tigray. So far, what actions have been taken to combat the situation? How can we coordinate with UN Women and other relevant organizations that work on women's rights to resolve or develop a working document at the very least? So if you could, as quickly as you could, if you could address this. I know it's a very big question, but thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I don't want to focus, I don't want to give a reductive perspective of the genocide that's happening by only focusing on the rampant rape. So what I want to say is, for anyone who's concerned about the well-being of women, we should all push for the war to stop. It's only when hostilities are, stopped that women could be saved, and that we can try to do our very best to help the women that have already been impacted, not only by the war, but in addition to that, by the rape. So my advice is reach out to UN Women, reach out to any intergovernmental institution, and ask them to push the warring parties to stop, the genocide, so that we'll be able to enter to Tigray and help. But up until that day comes, of course, we all need to research on how we can best support rape survivors of sexual harassment and abuse. We can mobilize resources. As I said earlier, these women, most of them, they don't have access to contraception methods, and so they're pregnant with babies that came from their invader, someone who violated them, and they should have the option whether to keep those babies or not. And some of them are also exposed to STD and other kind of diseases. And so to help this woman, as I said earlier, we should focus on stopping the war, silencing the guns, and so continue to tweet at Stop Tigray War, Tigray Genocide, and push for your regional and intergovernmental institutions to take concrete action into saving this innocent woman and by large the Tigrayan population.
Thank you, Maza. That's a great segue into what will be our final question. Thank you again to all the panelists. This question is, what actions need to be taken in the short term, so within the next 6 months, that can help lead to lasting peace and stability? And what are some trusted and verified charities or organizations that we can donate to help the victims of this conflict? And maybe Getachew, if you want to start.
Okay. In this, not only in these 6 months, but I would say in the 6 days or 1 week, 2 weeks, one of the most pressing issues is the withdrawal of the Eritrean troops for 2 things. One, they are hampering the humanitarian access or the humanitarian aid, I could say, along with the Ethiopian government. Second, the issue of sovereignty. We cannot talk with the Tigray people, after many years or many months, if the Eritrean troops are pushed by or are forced to withdraw by like United Nations or whatever, any other powerful nations. I don't think it would be possible to talk with Tigrayans as part of Ethiopia. This is because of 2 things. One, we all know that they are denying the people because of their vengeance. They are denying the people humanitarian access. They are killing the people. They are looting, not in an organized way. So the first most important pressing issue we could do, in many ways, it could be in digital activism or by contacting what you call our representatives or international humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, whatever, is the withdrawal of Eritrean troops. And the second one is cessation of hostilities. That's also the most important thing. The third one, most probably, that is the most important, that would be the first one, but because of these, 2 things that cannot be achieved easily is, the provision of humanitarian access to the people. But we are, I'm getting reports that humanitarian access at this time is not possible because of the Eritrean forces or because of the still hostilities are going on in Tigray. So for me, these 3 things are most important issues, and we should work together in a very short time. There may be other political solutions that would take time, like in a long term, whatever. But also I need to take 30 seconds or 1 minute to add another point that is not built in this discussion. The ethnic profiling of Tigrayans out of Tigray. It's going to be in Addis Ababa or all over Ethiopia. So we have, Tigrayans in internment camps. They could be, from the military, or they could be from the police, or they could be civilians. There are, there is forced, what you call, they might be forced, to take what you call leave from their jobs, or they could be dismissed without any notice, whatever. So we should, give focus also for the ethnic profiling that is going on actively in Ethiopia, all over, the places, or all over the regions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Samuel, I know that you have to go just in a minute. I want to just give you the opportunity to respond to that if you would like.
Thank you. So with regards to your question, sort of two-pronged, right? One is what needs to be done immediately, and what can people do to support? So firstly, I think there is no greater pressing issue than the provision of humanitarian aid that is unfettered, that is able to access all of Tigray. 4.5 million people starving is just, unjust doesn't even begin to describe how insane this situation actually is. And so without feeding people, and when I say unfettered humanitarian access, that solves several things, right? It solves the Eritrean issue because for unfettered access to occur, Eritrean troops do need to be removed. But that also does solve for the lack of information because when the international community has unfettered access, they're going to see everything. I mean, we don't need to tell them anything. They're going to see it firsthand. So unfettered humanitarian access is going to be absolutely critical. Our people need to eat. The only guarantee in this war is that people are dying, whether it is through bullets, through bombs, or through starvation, people are dying. That's just the guarantee here. And that's the ugliness of war, because war brings about carnage. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of who to donate to, I'm not going to get myself in trouble and start listing organizations. I know better than that. But what I will say is, at a very high level, I have fundraised for and continue to support the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. They are my trusted go-to for contributions for refugees Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. But my only advice would be, because of the proliferation of disinformation and fake fundraising that's going on, and all sorts of other issues online, please be careful who you give money to. Please be careful who you retweet. Please be careful what you tweet, right? For the Tigrayans that are in the audience and that are listening to this, we are the voice of Tigray, whether we like it or not. We didn't ask to be, we didn't nominate ourselves to be, but until our people's voices can be fully respected and heard again, we have to speak on their behalf. So let's remember that we speak on behalf of Tigray in all of our activism. Let's keep them in mind and do whatever is in their best interest, first and foremost. Secondly, though, only give contributions to organizations that are registered, that have in the United States, it would be a tax ID number. In other countries, there are other processes for this. Make sure that you're giving to reputable fundraising sources only, whether it is to refugees in Sudan or to relief efforts in Tigray. There's also going to be a lot of fundraising that's going to need to happen for the long haul, right? Because even if there's a ceasefire today, we're going to need to rebuild Tigray. As Maza said, the work of Tigray over the last 30 years is being demolished. And so there's going to need to be a lot of reconstruction that happens in Tigray. And I certainly hope and believe that it's not going to take 30 years. So I would just urge everybody to do your homework. All of us on this stage are very accessible people. And so feel free to always reach out, but please do your homework, because the internet can be a crazy place. And there's a lot of fraudulent fundraisers that have opened up in the last several weeks. And that really concerns me, because it's undermining our work. So I have to jump off, but really thank you to State of the Horn. Thank you to you young women for your leadership. I know that you all come from different ethnic backgrounds, and that you are coming together to raise awareness on what's happening in Tigray, but also throughout Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. I mean, you're doing God's work. So thank you to you, and have a good night, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And thank you to Maza and Getachew, and of course.
Could I just say a few words on that? Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want the audience to understand that the immediate need is not money. The people of Tigray are not starving because there isn't an international NGO or the Tigrayan diaspora community who are not ready and willing to provide the much needed and life-saving aid. The problem is the lack of access. So anyone who wants to help, as Getachew said earlier, needs to advocate first and foremost for the immediate withdrawal of foreign forces, mainly Eritrean troops from Tigray, because the very little aid that international NGOs were able to, deliver to Tigray have been looted by Eritreans, like from certain borderlines, or are either routed back to other regions of the country. So we need the Eritrean troops to be out of Tigray. That's the immediate and foremost thing that everyone who cares about the well-being of human beings, who abhors injustice and genocide, should advocate for. Secondly, the most important thing, as everyone else said, is humanitarian corridor, and it needs to be unfettered, and it shouldn't be administered or controlled by the Ethiopian regime. Because we have seen how the Abiy Ahmed's region have signed 2 agreements with the UN up until today, and one more was the World Food Program recently, but we have seen how that aid has been weaponized. So we want it to be administered by international NGO and aid workers so that our people could actually have access to it. And third is for everyone, again, to advocate for, the international independent investigating team to be on the ground to look into what happened, not only in Meqaleh or Humura Aksum, but also in Maikadra, because that issue, because of the premature and biased reporting from from Amnesty International, Tigrayans have been exposed to even more violence. So we want an independent and an immediate investigation, and we hope everyone would push for that. Regarding places where to donate financial money, if you feel like, knowing all of this, if donating some amount of money is the best you could do, please donate to international NGOs. But if you also want to donate to Tigrayan-based non-profit organizations, there is TDA, which is Tigray Development Association. This is an association that has been actively involved in the development of Tigray for the past 30 years. They have been mainly focused on building schools, but currently, because of the dire humanitarian crisis, they have shifted gears and they're mobilizing resources for that. So feel free to donate to that nonprofit organization as well. You will be able to get, all detailed information about them if you look them up. There are several GoFundMe accounts, but I want to take this opportunity to thank you all, for creating this platform so that we could come and amplify the plight of innocent people. And I hope we will get to continue to do this, because until the people of Tigray are free of, insecurity and violence, we should speak up. We have to do what is right. And you don't necessarily need to be from Tigray to see the wrong in war and in genocide. And so I appreciate you ladies for taking the initiative and putting this event together. And thank you so much for having me as a panelist too.
Thank you so much. So we are going to wrap it up here. We want to thank all of the attendees for joining us and listening, and all the questions that you submitted both before and during the event. Obviously, we can't get to all of them, but we do hope that people will continue to engage with this. As well, we do have a survey where you can give us feedback on the event. You can tell us if you thought it was great, if you thought it could be better. We want to know, and we do actually take that feedback into account when we plan our future events. So that's how we learn about topics that people want to talk about. guests that you want to hear from, that you want to ask questions of. So please do complete that survey. The link is in the chat. And please also feel free to email us stateofthehorn@gmail.com if you have any questions about this event or anything else. We always want to promote information, transparency, being open to different perspectives from your own. So that's the goal of this platform. And so again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to our panelists, Getachew, Maza, Samuel, and then Ambassadors Brazil and Shin. Thank you so much, everyone. Getachew and Maza, if you all want to stay back for a few minutes for a quick debrief, if you have the time, we would appreciate that. But we will be ending the Zoom meeting for everyone else. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you at our next event.